Hi, everyone. Before we get into the details of photosynthesis, the light reactions, Calvin cycle, and all of that ridiculousness, I wanted to post something that goes over the big picture understanding, because without a wider view of things, it's really hard to have any place to learn those details. So let me start on the whiteboard. And this is going to be an overview of photosynthesis, specifically starting with the chloroplast. And before we get too far, key thing about photosynthesis is it has one and only one function, which is to generate sugars. All right, specifically, we're going to generate a specific sugar. I'm going to draw it over here. It is called, I'm going to place this over here. The sugar that is produced by photosynthesis is not actually glucose. It's something called glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate. More simply put, it's basically half of a glucose. And so I'll just list it as G3P, okay? That is the sugar that is produced by photosynthesis. Again, photosynthesis doesn't directly, chloroplasts don't generate glucose. This has the ability to be converted into a glucose though. So this can very easily be shunted and converted into glucose, and that can be polymerized into all sorts of other carbohydrates or converted into other sugars. So using glucose, we can then, make some starch, we can make various fibers, et cetera, et cetera. This sugar is also the basis for making all of the other molecules in a plant. Remember, the purpose of photosynthesis isn't just making sugar so you can burn it in mitochondria, right? That's kind of a zero-sum game. Yes, we are making sugar. Some portion of it is going to get converted into a form that will go into mitochondria, right? So I guess I could draw that over here. So that will certainly happen, right? That will certainly happen. A certain subset of the sugar that is produced by a plant will get used for metabolic purposes in terms of cellular respiration. So sure, right? That will happen. But the majority of sugar that's produced by a plant is for growth. Again, the purpose of doing this is that you can make all the molecules you need to survive and grow. So that means making your starches for storage, making your fibers for cell walls. That means making amino acids. That means making phospholipids. That means making nucleic acids, nucleotides. Now, before we get too far on this aspect, realize that this is a sugar, so it's just made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So while you can build it into some lipids and other carbohydrates to convert it into amino acids, phospholipids, or nucleotides, you're going to need some additional nutrition. So that's going to come from typically soil solution. So being absorbed from the roots of a plant, you'll be getting nitrates. So you'll need a nitrogen source. You'll also need a phosphate source for phospholipids. And for nucleotides, you'll need both. Again, the nitrogen source is going to be nitrates or ammonia or ammonium. The phosphorus source is going to be phosphate groups. So I'll just list that as inorganic phosphate. So that's the big picture of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get sugars so that we can build every single organic molecule that allows a plant to grow. Okay, so how do we get that sugar? Well, how we get that sugar is the process that we know as photosynthesis. Okay, that's the process called photosynthesis. I'm going to actually modify this just a little bit. Kind of screwed up the orientation here. So the process of photosynthesis does build a sugar out of what you'd expect, right? We're using carbon to build a sugar. The carbon source is going to be CO2. So I'll list it up here. And so carbons are going to be polymerized, sort of. This is not an accurate description, but the carbons are going to be incorporated into a carbohydrate. Okay, now that process is known as the Calvin cycle, and I'll list that right here. So the Calvin cycle is the process that takes the Calvin cycle is the process that takes CO2 and generates sugars from it. Now, how do we understand how this works? Well, there are two things that are key things to understand here. One is that this is an endergonic process. We're synthesizing something. We're starting with 6 small molecules, and we're going to build sort of a couple bigger ones. So this is an endergonic process. So we're going to need an energy source. We're going to need something that can drive this endergonic process. Hopefully you remember what that is. The other thing to remember is when we burn sugars, like here, this is an oxidation process. So as sugars are broken down, electrons are torn from them, right? And that is an oxidation. So if we want to take CO2 and build it into carbohydrates, we're going to need to add electrons back. So this process is both endergonic and it's a reduction process. So those are the two things that are key to understand for the second half of photosynthesis. So again, this is an endergonic process and it is a reduction. So I'll put a little note here. So Calvin cycle, endergonic by nature, not when it's fully complete, okay? And it's also a reduction. So we're gonna need some electrons, all right? An energy source and electrons. So how are we gonna do this? Well, hopefully earlier in the unit, you remember that the way we drive endergonic reactions is to couple them with something that's more exergonic. So the entire thing has a negative delta G. So the way we usually do this in our cells is to couple endergonic reactions to the hydrolysis of ATP. So that's what we're going to do here. And I'm missing a bunch of my markers, so I'll just make do with whatever I can find here. Okay, so this is going to be one of the things that's going to occur here is we're going to basically consume ATP. So ATP is going to be consumed during the process of the Calvin cycle because we're going to build sugars. And the other thing is we're going to need some electrons. So we're going to need electrons being carried from somewhere else. And our electron carrier is going to look familiar. NADPH. You'll notice there's an extra letter there. This is a slightly different molecule than the NADH that you learned about when it comes to cellular respiration. Functionally, though, it serves the same purpose. Functionally, it serves the same purpose. We are going to use it as an electron carrier, and here it's going to drop off its electrons to allow CO2 to be built into G3P. So this will be consumed by the process and recycled. And again, notice it does look like NADH. It does have an extra phosphate group. So this is NADPH. The P is not for photosynthesis, but hey, helps you remember it. Okay, so what we'll find is that there are two different sets of reactions to photosynthesis. First, there are what are called light reactions. And secondly, there's the Calvin cycle. What you just saw is all you need to know about the Calvin cycle. That's it. You are going to have to understand quite a bit more about the light reactions, which we'll cover next time. What I do want you to see is that in order to do the Calvin cycle, we're going to need to produce two things in the light reactions. They're shown right here. Our light reactions need to generate ATP and NADPH. We'll talk about that next time. Thanks, everybody.